Hello, and welcome to Amateur Bomb Museum, the poetry podcast preferred by alley cats and amnesiac angels everywhere. I'm your host, Victoria Brockmeyer, and today I'm going to do something a little different from usual with a series of pieces by Jack Spicer. Spicer lived and wrote mainly in the San Francisco Bay Area in the middle of the last century. I only started reading him about halfway through my PhD. I'd never heard of him before then. But he immediately became one of the 2 or 3 most important poets in the entire canon for my work, and for that matter, for my sense of poetry as a milieu where I belong. Spicer did not have a great life. He was an alcoholic, he was argumentative even when he was sober, extremely moody, not an easy person to deal with. And he was perpetually falling for unavailable men. Married men, definitely 100% straight men who were just never going to be into him. The pieces I have for us today are letters he wrote to someone who was probably in this last category, a young, beautiful poet who'd been in San Francisco for a bit, then moved back home to Indiana. They pick up probably in late November, shortly after this guy, James Alexander, had moved back to Indiana, and end just after Valentine's Day. Spicer died in 1965, and the first collected edition of his poems, edited by his friend Robin Blazer and published in 1975, didn't include these letters, although Spicer read them publicly and treated them as poetic works. It wasn't until 2008, with the publication of a new, more comprehensive collected called My Vocabulary Did This to Me, that they saw daylight again. Like all Spicer's writing, these letters, poems, letter poems, poetic letters are beautiful and witty and a little edgy and strange. What makes them stand out in his corpus, and what may have kept Blazer from publishing them in 75, is their powerful emotional honesty. They're just gorgeous. They're an extended meditation on love and longing and every kind of distance. When My Vocabulary first came out and I got my copy, I read them and I loved them. And right away, I wanted to put a recording of them up somewhere so the internet could find them if it wanted to. This was long before I had any idea to do a poetry show. Now that I have the platform, I hope I'm able to do them justice. So for all of us who've ever loved with our whole hearts, Jack Spicer's letters to James Alexander. 1. Fort Wayne, Indiana, is the capital of nitrogen. All streets end there. No buses arrive there except those that carry direct mail or cargoes of Negroes en route on the Underground Railway. There has never been a city made up of so many arms. You can see Troy, New York in the distance. Christmas poems and lovers' holly branches grow there in the winter, as well as stuffings of turkeys, memory pie, and little droppings of passing angels. It is not reached by air. Fort Wayne, Indiana has industries and tournament golf and blocks of weeping buildings. It is built on high ground above the slough of utter unwinding. The birds, which all look like seagulls or cormorants, in its artificial sky finish singing when the day is over. At night, they look like elephants. People watch them with telescopes as they hover. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, the trees are dying, and you can see footprints in the rather wet snow. People take their motor scooters to bed with them. Come back to California. Come back to California, every mapmaker is pleading to James Alexander. What do the sparrows eat in the winter? I asked someone once in Minneapolis. He replied, they eat horse turds if they can find them. There are acres of cold snow. Love, Jack. too. Railroad trains lost their balance, and buses stood on their hind ends and licked their wounded wheels when James Alexander came back to California. And poor airplanes dripped sweat from their wings, and little cars mooed as if they were not quite convinced they were mechanical. When James Alexander came back to California, he and the other poet who exists in the universe formulated a series of true propositions. That poetry alone can love poetry. That poems cry out to each other from a great distance. That poets, being bastard fathers, love each other like bastard fathers when they see their children playing together. That poems play together from a great distance. It was made illegal for a bachelor to watch poems. When James Alexander came back to California, they hunted mushrooms together in the cold rocks of the Berkeley Hills. They invented a game which was more complicated than bridge or chess or football, which was played with gum and chalk and a piece of common wrapping paper. They made it utterly impossible to identify God. Having a hand in each other's hand, they walked down every street on which it was possible to walk, having the pavements dictated to them by an angel. They purged history of contemporary reference. They wrote poetry that had to be looked at from a distance on a gigantic playground. Their children split words. The scholars who found these children died in agony. One thumb opposed one thumb. Each thumb was the center of the universe. They forged a lost manuscript of Rimbaud's La Chasse Spirituelle for their own purposes. It was mysteriously discovered to have been written in English. They found that they had one tongue. We shall find that we have one tongue. I hope we shall find that we have one tongue. Love, Jack. 3. Dear James, I don't know if there is room in the world for a post office, but you come across them often enough, if you don't make the mistake of pretending that they're in a fixed place like the moon, and if you don't let their continual changes bewilder you. It's rather like hunting mushrooms. They grow in certain places, and you can never be sure where their certain places will be after the next rain, but you get a sense of where they won't be, and don't go there. Unless, of course, they tell you. The letters, poems, kisses, since the original game of post office is stuck in the mysterious regions of childhood, are directed by a fantastically inefficient system, up to the place where poetry comes from, and then back down again to the person whose poetry, or letters, or love was meant to receive it. It is a lot different from airmail. And it is almost impossible to list the random places from which they will deliver their letters. A box of shredded wheat, a drunken comment, a big piece of paper, a shadow, meaningless, except as a threat or a communication, a throat. Believe them all, but obey the post officers who tell you when to believe them or obey them. If you don't have money for the money order, why not send me the pawn tickets? I have money for a few months, and I will send you pawn tickets with the equivalent of a watch and a typewriter upon them. The real pawn tickets are letters. Love, Jack. 4. Dear James, went down to Duncan and Jess's Friday to read them the letters. Their house is built mainly of Oz books, a grate to burn wood, a second story for guests, paintings, poems, and miscellaneous objects of kindly magic. Cats. It is a place where I am proud, we are proud, to read the letters. It is a post office. I had not realized how little alone one is in a post office. Before, I had merely posted the letters and wondered. It is possible, if you have the humility, to create a household and the sense to tread on all pieces of bad magic as soon as they appear, to create a post office. It is as mechanical as Christmas. Late at night, we drank a gallon of wine and talked about the worlds that had to be included into our poetry. Duncan wanted me to send Creeley the letters because Creeley, he said, needed the letters. And I went to bed upstairs with George MacDonald's Lilith. I had to piss and walked down the outside stairs and saw, or heard, but I think I saw, the ocean and the moonless stars that filled the sky so full of light, I understood sighs for the first time. They seemed, while I was pissing away the last of the wine and the conversation, a part of the post office too. This I promise, that if you come back to California, I will show you where they send the letters, all of them, the poems and the ocean, the invisible love, Jack. Five. It is not the monotony of nature, but the poems beyond nature that call to each other above the poets' heads, the heads of poets being a part of nature. It is not for us to make the lines of nature precise. It is for the poems to make the lines of nature precise, because of their fatal attraction for the lines of nature, for our heads. We proclaim a silent revolution. The poems above our heads, without tongues, are tired of talking to each other over the gabble of our beliefs, our literary personalities, our attempts to project their silent conversation to an audience. When we give tongue, we amplify. We are telephone switchboards, diluted into becoming hi-fi sets. The terrible speakers must be allowed silence. They are not speaking to us. How is it, then, our business to talk of revolution, we heads of poets, one named Jack and one named James, three in the distance named Ebby, Charles, and Robert? It is because we, as their victims, as their mouthpiece, must learn to become complete victims, complete pieces of their mouth. We must learn that our lips are not our own. A revolution is a savage education. There are people that talk about poetry like tired insurance clerk talk about baseball. Oops, let me fix that. There are people who talk about poetry like, I guess I better do it right. There are people that talk about poetry like tired insurance clerks talk about baseball. They must be destroyed by our silence. Even the hatred of them interrupts the conversation that our poems wish to continue. Even the mention of them makes it me talking, crashes into paradox that was their truth. We do not write for each other. We are irritable radio sets. But the image of the talking head of a horse on the wall in Cocteau's first Orpheus was a truer image. But our poems write for each other, being full of their own purposes, no doubt no more mysterious in their universe than ours in ours. And our lips are not our lips, but are the lips of heads of poets, and should shout revolution. Love, Jack. Six. Dear James, it is absolutely clear and absolutely sunny, as if neither a cloud nor a moon had ever been invented. I am lying here on the grass of the University of California, a slave state, but one which today seemed peculiarly beneficent. I have not had a letter from you in weeks. I read them all, your letters and mine, to the poets assembled for the occasion last Wednesday. Ebby was annoyed, since he thought that letters should remain letters, unless they were essays, and poems, poems. A black butterfly just flew past my leg, and that the universe of the personal and the impersonal should be kept in order. George Stanley thought that I was robbing Jim to pay James. They sounded beautiful, all of them. Things cannot die in such a spring, unless the old men of the world commit suicide, our suicide, over the question of whether East Germans be called East Germans in diplomatic notes, and every leaf and flower of this red-hot February asks me to remember this. Though it is on the other side of poetry, spring, thank whatever created both of them, is spring. And I am not sure on a day like this that the living and dying world does not have something analogous to poetry in it, that every flower and every leaf, properly read, is not a James as well as a Jim. Things cannot die in such a spring, and yet your silence, for the spring itself proclaims that there are such things as clouds and moons, frightens me when I close my eyes or begin to write a poem. I wish you were with me now on this grass, and could be with me like the leaves and the flowers in the grass, a part of this spring. Jim and James. Love, Jack. Seven. Dear James, the only place I've found to retire into is your watch. I haven't covered it with bark, and it is in no sense beautiful, but I haven't worn a watch in 2 years, and I talked to it, mostly about you and what it was like to be worn on your wrist. And sometimes I spend a few seconds watching its second-hand stuttering by, green and nervous. And it really is, all things considered, a natural object, like a tree or a flower or a bark-covered table. A post office. And the watch believes what I tell it. There are 2 kinds of places in the world, it wants me to tell you: pawnshops and post offices. You will find it hard to re-educate. I don't like my poetry either. I read a new poem last Wednesday, and nobody said much of anything, and I asked why, and Duncan said it was because it was a very good Jack Spicer poem. And I threw the poem in the garbage sack, not tearing the poem, because it was a very good Jack Spicer poem. The watch was ticking on my wrist all the time and was not a Jack Spicer wristwatch and would never be a Jack Spicer wristwatch. And that should be the way with poems. It's rather like a medium, a real medium, who gets a spirit, call her Little Ava, to control her. Pretty soon, after a few sessions, she'll get to know what Little Ava is going to say and start saying it for her. Then it's no longer a seance, but fakery, and time to change spooks. That's what your watch tells me. Time to change spooks. Shit, I gotta fix that. Alright. That's what your watch tells me. Time to change spooks. I don't know what your table tells you, but if you came back to California, we might arrange a favorable exchange of spooks. Love, Jack. 8. Dear James, this letter is entirely from the other Jack, the nervous, worried guy who puts letters into envelopes and receives them from same. The other Jack, the one who wrote you all the letters, is puzzled about the change of post offices. This Jack, me, being more practical, is wondering, A, did you receive his last letter about watch, P.O. versus pawn shop, ghost trading, etc., before letters of 31st, 1st ult, or at all? B, is someone reading and destroying his letters? Because if so, don't, because it is harmless to the real world, insofar as poetry is harmless to the real world. Which is not so far. Or C, what? He, the other Jack, is probably asleep. I hate him sometimes. It was really my suggestion, on account of B, is sending this letter from the address of an imaginary little magazine. We have both still our own love, insofar as I can say it too. Jack. 9. The mirror does not break easily, regardless of what is reflected in it. I think I'm going to fix that. All right. The mirror does not break easily, regardless of what is reflected in it, regardless of whether there are blue apples, Rimbaud, or even angry white light belonging in it. Imprisoned, one might say, in the death of its surface. It is the oblique patience of an Alice who plays with her cat and waits for something between her and the image to melt away. It is the oblique patience of children. When you rush bravely against the mirror, shouting, "This is also my universe," you are likely merely to get a bloody nose. That surface has no patience with violence. Even as these letters are our mirrors, and we, imprisoned singly in the depths of them. So it is, the violence of the impatient artist, that I keep trying to draw the form of these letters to a close, merely because I am going to read them to an audience of boobies and 1 or 2 poets. Ridiculous attempt to break the glass. The letters will continue. The letters will continue after both of us are dead. The letters would continue even if we were in the same room together, even though our faces were so close that we could hardly speak, or so distant that our hearts could not touch. Shit, let me fix that last sentence. The letters would continue even if we were in the same room together, even though our faces were so close that we could hardly speak, or so distant that our hearts could not touch. Mirror breaker! I simply do not have the patience merely to let the mirror dissolve. I keep tapping my hand on it. Help me. Love. Jack. 10. Dear James, I'll not explain the mistakes the other Jack made in the last letter. They're obvious. And I'm sure they belong to the poetry of it somewhere, too. I am glad that you're not going to New York. Letters sent to there or received from there would be filled with worms. Any other city. But, of course, if you come here, there will be a double advantage, for if Jim and the other Jack can't talk to each other, and won't let James and Jack talk to each other, unlikely, because of the bridge of love we have erected between us, but possible, God knows, we can still, defying both of them, send letters to each other from the same city, which would be as unnatural as poetry often is. Our letters again will cross. Your watch will count out the days and hours of the month, as our letters will. Love, Jack. 11. Dear Jim. Let me fix that. 11. Dear Jim, I'm writing this letter to you, rather than James, as it is a Christmas letter, and both he and I would find it uncomfortable. Like saying Merry Christmas to Rimbaud. You, on the other hand, having several faces, will be able to select a face appropriate to its reception. Religion is the shadow of the obvious. And all the paraphernalia of Christmas, from the Christ child to the Santa Claus selling ties in a department store window, is just this, religion, the infinite shadow that a false beard or a plaster child can cast. What is under that book lying face downward on the bed, or that green radio on the floor? Whatever it is, disappears when you pick the object up. But on holidays, you can see the shadow that the thing casts. That is why a real child is born on Christmas, why there is a Santa Claus. Why am I writing you to tell you about this? It is because I am afraid that you may be too young to believe, and James too busy to believe in this holiday, that you may confuse the shadows with the things that cast them, and believe that there is nothing there. This is not important to James, to the poet who can watch in his own poetry something even more than these shadows, but it is you I am wishing Merry Christmas. Tell James I am reading my poetry in public on February 14th, and at it, reading all his letters. Jack. 12. Dear James, it was not really the thought of reading them, because I didn't, not on Valentine's Day, which would be a threat of perfection, but tomorrow to poets at one of those poetry meetings that were in your time Sundays. But as the prose stretches like a big rubber ball with no middle to it, but the hoverings and threats of evil, do you understand magic, or do I have to teach it to you? That made me lean on the death of our letters. It is a black thing, evil is, having nothing to do with good and bad, or even beautiful and fucked up. Having much more to do with the inside and outside of a man than good does. The opposite of it is poetry or pajamas or Paracelsus or anything else in the universe that begins with P. Magic begins with M and is neutral. So does man, more, much, me, made, middle, meetings, and the last half of tomorrow. Evil denies that this could even be an alphabet. This is so near to the truth that I don't want to finish the letter. Love that begins with an L, like my heart does. Love, Jack. 13. Dear James, Sundance have just arrived. They speak in wholly, think how they would divide that word, wholly different language. I should have known, in the places in the letters, but that was more like seeing the impossible footprints of a bird on the wet sand. And now, seeing the bird, I don't know why, but I keep thinking of a pterodactyl. How can they be read by voice? But why in hell should we have to use our mouths to hear messages? And the letters of the alphabet, as Thoth and Rimbaud both told me, are more than mere sounds. But I want to hear the words from your mouth. That's what one unsurprised part of me demands. Like when they didn't have any way to write them down and they had to be chanted around a fire in a cave or a banquet hall. And the words and the sounds of the words were the same thing. But at that rate, the painter would still be chiseling pictures of animals on blank rock. Tired arguments. Sundance are a school of real birds having come from somewhere up there. I take off my head to you. Love, Jack. 14. In the Grand Pyramid, they buried the king with all his bottles, postage stamp, and half-eaten loaves of bread. Were they really the king's, Cocteau asks us in his article on memory, or were they manufactured for the occasion? No one knows better than I do how lonely you are. In the Grand Pyramid, there are the most complicated mathematical systems and the most complicated moral systems in chains of amethyst and diamond, hanging just out of reach. It is the center of the universe. Were they invented for the occasions? In the Grand Pyramid, it is darker than it ever was, and the king is still there. The king communicates by magic, and he tells me, build a pyramid for yourself. And he tells you, find a postage stamp. And he eats a little of the bread and drinks a little from the bottles he has manufactured. The postage stamp has a picture of the Grand Pyramid engraved on it. The pyramid has not yet been invented. No one knows how lonely you are, better than I do. Happy Valentine's Day.